Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's Chapter 20 Review, Girding for War, the North and South. In Lincoln's inaugural address, he was firm yet conciliatory. He said there was no conflict unless the South provoked it, and secession was wholly impractical because the North and South were conjoined twins, bound inseparably together. Secession would have created new controversies. What share of the federal debt should the South be forced to take? What portion of jointly held federal territories should Confederate states be allotted, and how should the fugitive slave issue be resolved? A united United States had been paramount as a republic in the Western Hemisphere, and if the USA broke into two hostile parts, then Europe could transplant their concept of the balance of power, play a divide-and-conquer game, creating a disunited states, and defy the Monroe Doctrine and seize territory in the Western Hemisphere. This is a picture of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April 1861, and where the war began. The issue of the divided Union came to a head over a matter of federal forts in the South. As the seceding states left, they seized U.S. arsenals, mints, and other public property within their borders. Fort Sumter was in Charleston Harbor, and with the fort low on supplies, Lincoln decided that he was going to adopt a middle-of-the-road solution and notified the South Carolinians that an expedition would be sent to provision the garrison, not to reinforce it. He said basically he was making no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition, only bring them food and provisions. To the Southern eyes, provision still spelled reinforcement. The Union naval force started on its way to Fort Sumter, a move the South regarded as an act of aggression, and on April 12, 1861, the Carolinians opened fire on the fort. After 34 hours of bombardment, no lives lost, the garrison surrendered. The North was electrified and provoked to fighting. The fort was lost, but the Union was saved. Lincoln turned this tactical defeat into a calculated victory. He caused the South to begin the war. Lincoln, on April 15th, issued a call to states for 75,000 militiamen. Volunteers sprang to colors. April 19th and 27th, the president proclaimed the blockade of southern seaports, and he called for troops, and this aroused the South. Lincoln was now waging war from the southern view, an aggressive war on the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee reluctantly joined the Confederacy, as did North Carolina. 7 states became 11 as submissionists and Union shriekers were overcome. Richmond, Virginia, replaced Montgomery, Alabama, as the Confederate capital, too near Washington for strategic comfort on either side. This is a map of the seceding states with dates in order of secession. The border states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and they were the only slave states left in the Union. They contained a white population more than half of that of the entire Confederacy. With Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri manufacturing and their manufacturing capacity, the Confederacy would have doubled. The strategic Ohio River flowed along the northern border of Kentucky and West Virginia. 2 navigable tributaries, the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, penetrated deep into Dixie. This area produced much of the Confederacy's grain, gunpowder, powder, and iron. The border states, Lincoln successfully used methods of dubious legality to retain them. In Maryland, he declared martial law, and he deployed Union troops to western Virginia and to Missouri. The statement of the North's war aims profoundly influenced the need to hold the border states. Lincoln declared that he was not fighting to free the slaves. Anti-slavery war was extremely popular in the butternut region of southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, which was an area settled by Southerners who carried racial prejudices with them, and a hotbed of pro-Southern sentiment within the Union. So the war did not begin between slave soil and free soil, but began as a war for Union, with slaveholders on both sides. Slavery also shaped the character of the war in the West. In Indian territory, most of the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles sided with the Confederacy. Some Indians, especially Cherokees, actually owned slaves. To secure their loyalty, the Confederate government agreed to take over the federal payments to the tribes. In return, the tribes supplied troops. Some Cherokees and most Plains Indians sided with the Union. The conflict between Billy Yank and Johnny Reb became a brothers' war. Many northern volunteers were from the southern states, and many southern volunteers were from the northern states. From the border states, one brother rode north, blue, while one brother rode south, gray. At first, the South seemed to have great advantages. They could fight defensively behind interior lines and wait for the North to come to them. The North had to invade the vast Confederacy, conquer it, and drag it back into the Union. The South only needed to draw to win its independence, and the South fought for self-determination and preservation. The South at first enjoyed very high morale. Militarily, the South had the most talented officers, especially Robert E. Lee. Ordinary Southerners were accustomed to managing horses and bearing arms. The South seemed handicapped by the scarcity of factories, but managed to obtain sufficient weaponry. The Southern drawbacks were that there were grave shortages of shoes, uniforms, and blankets. The economy was the South's greatest weakness, but the North's greatest strength. The North not only had huge farms, but also sprawling factories. This is a table showing manufacturing by sections in the United States, 1860. This is also a picture showing some of the technologies of war that were used during the war. Yankees boasted 3/4 of the nation's wealth and 3/4 of its 30,000 miles of railroads. The North controlled the seas with a superior navy as well. Sea power enabled the North to exchange huge quantities of grain for munitions and supplies from Europe. The Union enjoyed a much larger reserve of manpower. They had 22 million in their population, and the seceding states only had 9 million, including 3.5 million in slaves. Adding to the North's advantages, European immigrants continued to pour into the North. This is a table that shows the immigration into the United States from 1860 to 1866. Total immigration amounts, and then where they came from in Europe. 1/5 of the Union forces were foreign-born. Initially, ordinary Northern boys were less prepared than the Southern counterparts for military life, but the North was much less fortunate in its higher commanders as well. Lincoln used trial and error methods to find the most effective leaders, after going through a number of generals, finally uncovering Ulysses S. Grant. The Northern strengths over time proved decisive, and early in the war, the Confederate win seemed very possible. There were 4 fascinating might-have-beens. If the border states had seceded, if uncertain states of upper Mississippi River Valley had turned against the Union, if the wave of Northern defeatism had demanded an armistice, if Britain or France had broken the Union's naval blockade of Southern ports, then the South might have won. But as 4 failed to materialize, the South could not hope to win. This is a poster that was published in several languages to recruit immigrants for the Union Army. Successful revolutions generally succeed because of foreign intervention. Of the Confederacy's potential assets, foreign intervention was the most important. Europe's ruling classes were openly sympathetic to the Confederate cause. They had long abhorred American democracy, and they had cherished the fellow feeling for the South's semi-feudal, aristocratic social order. Most working people in Britain pulled for the North, and they had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and sensed that war might extinguish slavery if the North won. Fearing opposition at home, England and France decided not to challenge the Union's blockade. The British textile mills depended on the South for 75% of their cotton supplies. Why did King Cotton fail the South? The strong production in the pre-war years had caused exports to pile up, and the British actually had surpluses in their warehouses. Only later were many British workers unemployed. The direct effects of the cotton famine were relieved by the Union sending foodstuffs to feed unemployed British workers. The Union victories gave the North cotton to ship to Britain. The Confederates ran some cotton through blockades, and cotton growers in Egypt and India, responding to the high prices, increased output and captured a share of the world cotton markets. The booming war industries in England, which supplied the North and South, relieved the unemployment. King wheat and king corn, which were the monarchs of the northern agriculture, proved to be more potent than king cotton, and the North produced bountiful crops of grain and harvested them with McCormick's mechanical reaper. But because of bad harvests, Britain was forced to import these huge quantities of grain from America, so England needed access to food more than they needed access to the cotton. This is a political cartoon called The Pending Conflict, 1863, showing Great Britain and France looking on while the Americans struggle. The Trent Affair occurs in 1861, when a Union warship in Cuban waters stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent. The two took Confederate diplomats bound for Europe. The Britons were outraged and war preparations buzzed. The red-coated troops embarked for Canada, and Lincoln released the two prisoners because he did not want to face two wars at the same time. The issue with the Alabama was the second major crisis in Anglo-American relations. Non-neutral building in Britain of Confederate commerce raiders was occurring during this time period, and the Alabama had escaped in 1862 to the Portuguese Azores, loaded with weapons and crews from two British ships that followed it. Flying the Confederate flag and officered by Confederates, it was manned by Britons and never entered a Confederate port. Britain was the chief naval base of the Confederacy. British pirates captured over 60 vessels. The Alabama finally accepted the challenge from a Union cruiser off the coast of France in 1864 and was completely destroyed. The issue of the British-built Confederate raiders stayed alive, and Minister Charles Francis Adams prodded the British to see that allowing such ships was a dangerous precedent. Someday, this could be used against them. Britain did not remain neutral. The Confederate commerce destroyers, which were chiefly British-built, captured over 250 Yankee ships and severely crippled the American merchant marine. Angry Americans looked north and talked about grabbing Canada when the war was over. The final Anglo-American crisis had to do with the Laird Rams, which were two Confederate warships being constructed by John Laird and his sons in Great Britain. They were designed to destroy Union wooden ships with iron rams and large caliber guns. Minister Adams warned, "This is war," if the ships were released. London eventually relented and bought the two ships for the Royal Navy. Britain agreed in 1871 to submit the Alabama to dispute in arbitration. In 1872, they paid American claimants $15.5 million for damages caused by the commerce raiders. American rancor was also directed at Canada. The Confederate agents plotted to burn the northern cities, and one Confederate raid into Vermont left 3 banks plundered and 1 American citizen dead. The Dominion of Canada in 1867 was 2 great nations emerging from the fiery furnace of the American Civil War. One was reunited with the United States, and the other was a united Canada. The Emperor Napoleon III dispatched a French army to occupy Mexico City during this time period and installed a puppet government with Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. Both acts were flagrant violations of the Monroe Doctrine. And the United States aided the resistance movement led by Mexico's national hero Benito Juarez. After the Civil War was over, Americans prepared to head south to Mexico, and Napoleon realized his gamble was doomed, and he abandoned the puppet government in 1867, and Maximilian was then executed by a Mexican firing squad. The Confederate government had weakness. Its constitution contained one deadly defect. It was created by secession, and it could not logically deny future secession to its constituent states. Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy, wanted a strong central government, but he was opposed by states' writers. Richmond encountered difficulty persuading some troops to serve outside of their own state. Davis never enjoyed personal popularity and was often at loggerheads with his Congress. There was serious talk of impeachment. He was very overworked, and the task proved beyond his abilities. Lincoln also had his troubles, though. He was less experienced but more flexible than Davis, but he was able to relax at critical times, and old Abe grew as the war dragged on. He was tactful, quiet, patient, yet firm. He developed a genius for interpreting and leading fickle public opinion, and he demonstrated charitableness towards the South and forbearance towards the backbiting of his colleagues. This is a picture of Lincoln at Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg, 1862. Congress generally accepted or confirmed Lincoln's questionable wartime acts, but Lincoln did not expect his iron-handed authority to continue once the war had ended. Congress was not in session when the war had started, so Lincoln gathered the reins into his own hands. Brushing aside legal objections, he proclaimed a blockade, which was later upheld by the Supreme Court. Arbitrarily, he increased the size of the federal army, something that only Congress can do under the aspects of the Constitution. But Congress later approved it. He directed the Treasury to advance $2 million without appropriation of security to 3 private citizens for military purposes. This was a grave irregularity contrary to the Constitution. He also suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, so anti-unionists could be arrested, and this defied a dubious ruling by the Chief Justice that habeas corpus could be set aside only with authorization of Congress. His regime was guilty of many other high-handed acts. Jefferson Davis was less able than Lincoln to exercise arbitrary power, mainly because of the states' writers in the South. This shows amputation being done on the battlefield in Virginia. This was the result of new advances in technology, and many of the soldiers left the war as amputees. The war demanded men, and lots of men. The northern armies were first manned solely by volunteers, and each state assigned a quota based on population. By 1863, Congress passed the first conscription or draft law. It was grossly unfair to the poor. You could hire a substitute or pay $300 for exemption rights. The draft was opposed in Democratic strongholds of the North, especially as made evident in the New York draft riots of 1863. The New York anti-draft rioters were mostly Irish Americans during that time period that did not really want the slaves to be freed because they did not want to compete with them for jobs. Elsewhere in the North, conscription met with resentment and occasional minor riots. 90% of the Union troops were volunteers. Social and patriotic pressures as well as generous bounties were present. The deserters were still plentiful. Union Army recorded about 200,000 deserters over the course of the war, and the Confederate authorities were plagued with desertion, which was a problem of similar dimensions. The South relied mainly on volunteers at first, but was much less populous than the North, so Richmond resorted to conscription in 1862, a year earlier than the Union, and they robbed both the cradle and the grave. The Confederate draft worked serious injustices. This is the number of men in uniform at each date given during the war for the Union and the Confederacy. A man could hire a substitute or purchase exemption, and slave owners or overseers with 20 slaves could also claim exemption. The Confederation conscription agents avoided areas inhibited by sharpshooting mountain whites. The Northern economy had an easier time during the war. Excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol increased by Congress. The income tax was levied for the first time, and customs receipts were providing important revenue. Congress in 1861 passes the Morrill Tariff Act, which increases duties to some 5 to 10%, and soon increased by more by necessity of war. Partly to raise revenue, partly to provide more protection for prosperous manufacturers that were hit by the new internal taxes. The protective tariff became identified with the Republican Party, as most industrialists were Republican. The greenbacks, Washington had issued paper money totaling nearly $450 million at face value. For the printing press currency inadequately supported by gold, hence the value was determined by the nation's credit, and inflation undercut the value of the paper money. Bonds were a major source of war funding. The government netted a ton of money from the sale of bonds. Methods of sale, though through drives and payroll deductions, were not yet devised. The Treasury forced to market bonds through private banking houses of J. Cook and Company, which received a commission of 0.3%. With the profits and patriotism at stake, bankers succeeded in making effective appeals to citizen purchasers. The national banking system was the financial landmark of the war, and it was authorized by Congress in 1863. It was launched as a stimulant to sale of government bonds. It also established a standard banknote currency. The banks that joined the national banking system could buy government bonds and issue sound paper money which was backed by them. This was the first significant step toward a unified banking network since 1836. It existed for 50 years until it was replaced by the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Southern Confederacy had financial woes as well. Customs duties were cut off by the Union blockade. The Confederate bonds sold amounted to $400 million. Taxes increased sharply, and they imposed a 10% levy on farm produce. Short on revenue, the government was forced to print blue-backed paper money. Runaway inflation occurred, with Treasury notes totaling more than $1 billion. The Confederate dollar eventually was worth 1.6 cents. The inflation rate in the Confederacy was eventually over 9,000, and in contrast only to 80% for the Union. The wartime prosperity in the North was a little short of miraculous. New factories, sheltered by new protective tariffs, were mushrooming. Soaring prices pinched the day laborer and the white-collar worker to some extent, but the manufacturers and business people were raking in the fortunes of the war. The Civil War bred a millionaire class for the first time in American history. Graft was more flagrant in the North, partially because there was more to steal, and the greedy put profits before patriotism. The new labor-saving machinery enabled the North to expand economically. Even though the war drained off manpower, the sewing machine wrought wonders in fabricating uniforms and military footwear. The marriage of military need with innovative machinery ended the production of custom-tailored clothing and graduated to the standard measurements, were introduced for clothing. Mechanical reapers numbered 250,000 by 1865. They released tens of thousands to farm boys for army and fed them their rations. They produced vast surpluses of grain for export. They helped dethrone King Cotton. They provided profits to buy munitions and supplies from abroad and contributed to the prosperity of the North, a prosperity that enabled the Union to weather the war. Other industries were humming as well. The discovery of petroleum happened in 1859, and the 59ers went to Pennsylvania, where the birth of the petroleum plutocracy and coal oil Johnnies was taking place. 300,000 pioneers continued to push westward in the Homestead Act of 1862, and the only ocean-carrying trade was suffering a crippling setback. The Civil War was a women's war, too. Women were often assuming men's jobs as the men went to war, and in Washington, D.C., 500 women became government clerks, with more than 100 in the Treasury Department. Countless women were drawn into industrial employment. Some stepped up to the fighting front as well. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, America's first female physician, helped organize the U.S. Sanitary Commission to assist the Union armies. This is a booth at the Sanitary Fair in Chicago, which basically was a fair to raise money for soldier relief efforts. The U.S. Sanitary Commission trained nurses, collected medical supplies, and equipped hospitals. They helped women acquire organizational skills and self-confidence that would propel the women's movement forward. Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix helped transform nursing into a respectful profession, and they equally renowned was Sally Tompkins, who ran an infirmary for wounded Confederates. The women organized bazaars and fairs to raise money. The South fought to the point of exhaustion. They suffered destruction of war and suffocation as a result of the blockade. They possessed 30% of the national wealth in 1860, but claimed only 12% of it by 1870. The Civil War squeezed the average Southern income into 2/5 of the Northern level, which had been 2/3 in 1860, and the bid for independence exacted a devastating cost. Transportation collapsed. They were driven to economic cannibalism of pulling up rails to repair main ones. Window weights were melted down into bullets, and gourds were replacing dishes. To the end, the South mustered remarkable spirit. The women held up the menfolk, and the proposal was made that the women cut their long hair and sell it abroad, but this was stopped by the blockade. Women took pride in denying themselves silk and satins of their Northern sisters, and at the war's end, the North's captains of industry had conquered the South's lords of the manor. Cotton capitalism had lost out to industrial capitalism. And this is the chronology for the chapter.